Okay, so I think we can begin now. It's 8 p.m. already. So, hi once again. I'm Stephanie Orkuma, and I'm a UX strategist. So, if you follow me on Twitter, you probably already know me as, or you probably know me as Data Designer, the UX strategist. And basically, what I do is I help businesses match their goals to user needs, right? So, your business, you have goals, and you're trying to build a user centered product. I develop strategies that ensure that one, your product is user centered, and then secondly, you're able to achieve the goals you set out to achieve as a business. So that's basically what I do. And I want to begin with a story, right? And this is a story that I wrote about recently. I shared it on my Medium, and some people have already read it. Yeah. And so once upon a time, I was a designer who basically designed what she was asked to design, right? So I worked for a startup in Canada, and when they say, "Oh, Steph, we need this feature," I just go and I design that feature, and they're like, "Oh, Steph, we need this," and I just go and design that, right? Without any proper knowledge of how products are built, right, or how businesses are run. I was basically just designing. So I was passionate about designing for users. I was passionate about making the experience as seamless as possible. And that was all I really focused on, right? And before I go on with my story, I just realized that I did not mention there's a Q&A section rather. So if you have questions as I go, please feel free, to okay, that is open. So feel free to drop questions as we proceed, and I'll be happy to attend to them. Okay, so back to my story. I was basically just designing on vibes, right? Until one day I got bored. I was like, how can I move forward from this point I'm at, right? Because every day I wake up, I push pixels, and then I close my laptop and I sleep, and that's it for the day. How can I reach for more? How can I do better? How can I do more impactful work? How can I stand out from the crowd? In 3 to 5 years, I want to be able to look back and see, I achieved XYZ. And so I decided to read, right? Because at the start of my career, I read often, books like Refactoring UI, like this book by Don Norman, Design of Everyday Things, right? So these are books that I read at the start of my career. And I decided, okay, at this point, if I want to move forward, maybe I should return to books, and see how they can push me from one point to the other. And I followed Jonatoli on LinkedIn. And, at one time I looked at his website and I saw this book, Think First, that he authored. And I was like, okay, I should check this book out. And from the very first page, I was sold, right? So from the moment I read that book, I started reading that book, I knew that change was coming, right? So I don't know if anyone has experienced this, but you start reading a book and it is so insightful that your mind feels blown, right? That's what I experienced with Think First by John Atoli. And the book exposed me to a whole new level of thinking, right? So I wasn't just as a designer, as a UX designer, I was not just designing for my users. I was not just designing, user-centered products. I had to do so while considering business goals, right? So I remember one time at work, they were trying to redesign our onboarding process. And the goal of that redesign was actually to help to ensure users create accounts early on, right? So that we have, a number of accounts already active on the app. But I was like, is that really necessary? Is that what we need to do? Because if we are not redesigning it to, improve the experience, then why are we redesigning it, right? So now this new design, it's not like it had poor experience or it was set to have poor experience. The experience would still be great, right? But I just did not see the value of it. And that's because I was not thinking business goals. I was just thinking user needs, right? And then there was a little back and forth between me and my manager. But eventually I designed it for them, right? Because last night they pay me. But yeah, so that happened. And, when I started reading this book by John Atoli, I saw all the ways that could have been handled better. it opened my eyes to see how, you know, it's not just enough to design for users. You also need to design for businesses, right? And there's something he spoke about in the book. He has this structure, right? That at the very bottom you have abstracts, right? And as you rise to the top, it gets more concrete. Now, at the bottom of it, at the most abstract point, what we have is strategy, right? Strategy, and it translated to business goals and user needs. As you move upwards, on this structure that he had, you have things like scope, where you talk about product features, all of that. And then you move upwards to the skeleton, where you have, information architecture, and then you move upwards, up onto the top, where you have the actual visual design or the interface design, right? So at that very bottom, where he had business goals, user needs, strategy, I was like, what exactly does this mean? And so I wrote it down. So one thing I do, I always have notepads around me. I have like several books, several notepads that I'm always writing stuff in. So I jotted that down. I was like, oh, I should check this up, right? So I searched for it. I Googled it basically. I was like, strategy, business goals, user needs. What's that about? And I saw this article. I was introduced to UX strategy, and then I saw this article by Mays, right? So um, it's an article on UX strategy that basically explains what it is, how it functions, what value it plays in the business, in the company, all of that. So I read that, and in the article, it mentioned a book, and the book was UX Strategy by Jane Levy, right? Now, if you notice what's going on here, it began with a search for knowledge. It began with a search for more. I was trying to reach for more, and then I started with one book, and it led me to an article, and then that article led me to another book. So it was just on and on, seeking knowledge, finding knowledge, and growing in this knowledge. So I found the book UX Strategy by Jim Levy, and it blew my mind once again, right? It was tough to read. I won't lie. It has so many pages, so it took me a while to read through it, but it was very impactful and basically took me from point A to point B, right, in my career. Now, what the book speaks about is, of course, strategy, right? But she also talks about her story. She shares instances where she did X or she did Y or she did Z and the impact that it had, right? So, for example, there's a story of this guy who was starting a business, and he conducted surveys, and then he got positive responses, and so that led him to starting the business. And I think like 12 to 18 months later, he had no customer, not even one customer, right? So what Jane Levy, the author of this book, did is she came on board, she asked him, what did you do? How did you do it? And she realized that his approach could have been the problem, right? And so she developed new strategies to help the business, and eventually the business grew, and he started to have customers. Now that's a story she shared that can help guide me in my own journey, right? And that's the thing about books. That's the thing about reading. The authors, especially of books, the authors do not just tell you, oh, you should do XYZ. They actually share their stories, right? And these stories can help guide you as well, right? Just like they guided me. So what am I saying? Basically, I'm saying that books changed me, right? Books, not books actually reading, right? Because it's books and it's articles. They led me to where I am today. So this happened in August, right? When I got active about reading I'll be reading again. It was August last year, so basically 1 year from now. And what that did is 3 months later, I got a promotion at work, right? This is something that I've mentioned before. It was just, I'd spent just 1 year there. So I really did not expect that promotion, but it came because they had seen how much I grew or how much I was growing, right? And how much product knowledge I was having, how much business knowledge I was having, how I was able to contribute to conversations, to business conversations. And that was one of the things that impressed them enough to give me that promotion. And at the start of the year, that's this year, I got headhunted by a recruiter, and for a job. Afterwards, more gigs came. I mean, from last year, right? I was talking about research a lot last year, and I got clients for research in particular. So all of these things started to happen. None of these things were happening before, right? But it started to happen because I wasn't just a designer anymore. I had new knowledge. I had grown, I had evolved, I had learned new things. I had found ways to actually contribute to the business. So a lot of designers, are great at what they do, right? But the inability to show how they contribute to business goals sometimes is limiting, right? Or it holds back, employers or recruiters or hiring managers or all of those things. So what I was able to do is I was able to stand out, right? Because of this new knowledge that I had gathered. And I think one thing I want to say is when you expose yourself to new knowledge, it exposes you in turn to opportunities, right? So you expose yourself to new knowledge, and what it does is it builds you up, right, and sets you apart from everyone else. Now that's what happened to me, and that is what I've seen happen, with a lot of designers. So most of the designers that or you look up to, if you pay careful attention to them, you'd see that they are readers, right? So they read books, they read articles, even the ones who are a lot more UI focused rather. They still read books, right? There are a lot of UI books, that focus on the interface in particular, and these designers read those books. But beyond UI books, there are UX books, there are career related books that you can always reach out for. So if you look on the screen, on your screen, you probably see a pop-up, or you probably saw it at the beginning, that says, books I've read so far. Now, if you click that link, it takes you to an article I wrote that shows the list of books that I remember reading, right? I know I should have documented them while I was reading. I didn't. But if you go to the bottom of the article, rather, you'd see the books that I've read so far. So, if you want to check out the stuff that I've read, you'll be able to find all of those there. Now, what am I saying? I'm saying I want you to read more, right? It is not just okay to, go through life as a regular designer, put out great work, do great stuff, do impactful stuff, right? If you want to move from point A to B in your career, you need to expose yourself to quality materials, right? So basically, what takes you from point A to point B in your career is the quality of materials you feed your mind with, right? So I'll say that again. What takes you from point A to point B in your career is the quality of materials that you feed your mind with. So if you're not feeding yourself any new material, for example, that can be dangerous, right? So you want to keep learning, you want to keep growing, you want to keep learning new things, applying new things, and one way to do that is to read books, read articles, and they can move you right from point A to point B. And also something I have not mentioned enough is writing. Now, this I don't even know what's more difficult, reading or writing, yeah, because not everybody can be writers. But a lot of people struggle with reading too. But what I will suggest for people who read, right, or people who want to read, want to start reading, is start with articles, right? So if you're having trouble reading, you can start reading articles, short form, maybe one article per day, two articles per day, every day. And then from there, you can progress to a short book and then possibly a longer book. An alternative, of course, is audiobooks, right? So I wouldn't say I'm a fan. I've listened to a couple of audiobooks. So if that is more your vibe, please get into audiobooks, right? There's a lot of knowledge hidden behind or between the covers of a book that will transform your career, right? And the only way you can access that is if you actually get that book, right? And you feed yourself that book. So again, it could be physical books, it could be soft copies, it could be audiobooks. An alternative that isn't so great is actually looking at, should I say, summaries on YouTube, right? So, for example, if you go to YouTube now and you search UX Strategy by James Levy, you probably see videos that talk about the book, that sometimes summarize it. You'd see she herself, talking about the book and talking about the work that she does, all of that. So that's something you can do. You can always look for summaries on YouTube on books that you're interested in. So now to the writing side of things. I think once again I'll share a story of how, writing has helped me as well. I think I mentioned that around last year I started writing about, research, the research I was conducting and carrying out all of that. I started writing about the things I was learning. I was reading a lot of books. I read books like Just Enough Research, right? I read books like, user interviews. I read books. All of these books, what they did is give me in-depth knowledge of research. What I did afterwards was practice some of these things that I learned, right? I just set up practice projects and practice the things that I learned. And the next thing I did was write about the things that I learned. I did not believe I was an expert at that point. I did not think I was an expert. I did not think that, you know, I know the most, right? Concern I'll be on these topics. But what I did was I wanted to go deeper into the things that I was learning. And so I wrote about them. And that's one tip that, is very important. And I think it's something that some of us are already familiar with, right? The more you share your knowledge, the more knowledge that you have, right? It may not seem, like something that makes sense, but it does, right? I shared on, Twitter and LinkedIn how when, I was explaining a certain concept back in university, the concept stuck more with me because I was explaining it over and over again. And I'm sure that's something some of us here have experienced. And it's the same thing with writing. When you write about things that you've learned, they stick better with you, right? And sorry, and in my case, things like research, before I write about them, if you check out the articles I've written, I usually reference a lot of people, right? So four or five, at least four people are referenced in the articles that I write. And that means that I have to do research to be able to reference these people. So I'm reading books, I'm reading articles, and all of this is just so I can put them together to share my own knowledge, right? And that's what I did. And the impact that had, okay, of course, aside bringing in clients, was whenever I'm in a interview like situation. So sometimes it's for, an employer or a potential employer, sometimes it's with a potential client. And what happens is they ask you, oh, what's your research process like? What's even your design process like? I'm like, oh, most times where it's necessary, I start with research. And with research, I set objectives, I put up a research plan, and then I set questions, all of that stuff. I don't just say it, I show them, right? I'm like, oh yeah, and by the way, I wrote about, how to conduct usability tests, and it shows my process in detail. So I'm just going to drop the link here for you to check out. And, I've also written about, conduct setting research objectives. You can read it to see how I set research objectives, right? So I'm able to share these things during interviews or during calls with clients so that they know that I know my stuff, right? I wouldn't have been able to achieve that if I had not actually written these things. And I think it also extends to documentation in general. When you do work or in the process of the work that you do, please remember to document, right? Because I remember one time I was asked, how what practical steps do I take, right, to consider business goals in the work that I do? And it was easy for me to just share my screen and show them some of the documentation I've had or that I've made on projects I've worked on, right? I show, oh yeah, this is the user scripts that I wrote. This is the stakeholder interviews that I had. This is how I conducted it. This was my team. All of those things I was able to show because I wrote them down, right? And most of the time, it gets me that foot in the door that I need. So, once again, what am I saying? Write more. So, it's important that you read, but it's just as important to write as well. Yeah. So, a lot of people struggle with writing, and that's valid, right? But what I want to say is there are three things that you can start with, right? So if you want to just begin writing and you're not sure where to start from, you're not sure how to begin, there are three things that you could possibly write. So the first one is tell your story, right? So if you follow Victor Fatomi on Twitter, he's always talking about storytelling, tell your story, tell your story. And yes, that's one of the easiest ways to start writing. So you could just talk about what you've done, right? Talk about the work that you're doing, talk about your journey, right? Okay, just like the article that I linked here, I spoke about my journey. It's not like my entire journey, but I did highlight, certain parts of my journey that can be relevant. So you can do that. You can tell your story. You can talk about your journey. You can talk about the struggles that you've had. You can talk about the successes. You can talk about the failures, if you like, right? If you can be vulnerable enough to do that, please go ahead. But if not, that's also fine. But you want to talk about your story. And again, Victor, that's part of me, he says this as well. I remember one time a young man, commented on one of Victor's posts and was like, I do brand design or I do something if there's an opening at your company. And what Victor asked him was something in the lines of, can you point me to a thread or an article that tells your story? Right. So that I can see what sets you apart from everyone else. Right. I'm just paraphrasing basically, but that's what he was saying. And it sparked something in my mind. If you want to stand out, I mean, there are a lot of designers on Twitter in particular. There are a lot of designers in the country. There are a lot of designers around the world, right? What makes you stand out from the next designer? Is it just your design skills? Is it just your knowledge of Figma? What exactly sets you apart, right? That is what you want to communicate in your story. That unique thing that you have is what you want to talk about in your story. So if in instances where you're pitching to a potential employer or a client, what you can do is include a link to that story, right? This is my journey, this is what I've achieved, this is the struggles that I've had, this is the failures I've had, this is how I've been able to overcome my struggles, or how I've been able to overcome the failures that I've had, right? That is what you want to tell in your story. Now, a second thing that you can write about is the things you read about. So I mentioned earlier how I was reading books on research, and because of that, I started writing articles on research. You can do the same thing. So you can start just as what they call them now, summaries, right? Summaries of the books you've read. So you read UX Strategy by Jim Levy. What were those key points that she highlighted, right? So you identify those key points and then you talk about them, right? You explain your understanding of this point, and you share however you like to, yeah. And it's you could also write your thoughts, right? So for example, maybe okay, so maybe Jim Levy said, "Oh, you don't need to spend 5 months on a research project. You just need to do X, Y, Z in 2 days, and you have your research done." So maybe you read that and you disagree with it, right? You can write about that. You can write about that disagreement. If you disagree with what an author has written, it is okay to disagree respectfully with them, right? So it could be that you're wrong, nobody knows, or we may not know, right? But what that does is it shows that you are able to share your thoughts and your opinions constructively and comprehensively, right? So, in summary, when you read books, write about them. The third thing that you can also write about, if you're just starting out in writing, is the things you learn, right? So it's quite similar to the things you read, but this time around, it's not restricted to books. It's things you learn in general. So recently, someone tweeted about how he learned about, the nudge in Figma, right? How if you press shift, it moves your objects or your elements by 10 pixels, and then people are trying to say, oh, you can do it by 8 pixels, or set whatever nudge amount you want. That was something he just learned, right? Now, if you learn something like that and you think it is worth sharing, write about it, right? So you just learned that oh, you can't use a certain button in a certain instance, or you just learned that designers do XYZ or don't do whatever it is that you've learned. Just write about it, right? Because sometimes people will disagree with what you've written. Sometimes what you've written may not even be accurate, right? It may be wrong. But like I mentioned earlier, what matters is you're able to share your thoughts constructively and comprehensively, right? These are the things that really matter. So I think I've achieved what I wanted to do today. And those are two things. First, tell you the benefits or the importance of reading and writing and how it has worked for me, how it has transformed my life. And two is I wanted to share these steps, right? If you just want to start reading, what you do is start with articles, start with audiobooks, and then eventually move to actual books, right? And if you want to start writing, you start by writing summaries of books, you start by telling your story, and lastly, you just share things that you've learned, right? So I want to see if you guys have any questions. I know my session is coming to an end, so I want to ensure that. Let me announce that. Okay. So if you have questions, right, please go ahead to ask them. What you can, and please remember that the books that I've read, right, if you're interested in checking them out, there's a call to action that, that leads you to those books that I've written. Sorry, books that I've read. I should write books soon. But yeah, that's it. I cannot see any questions yet. Let's see. Okay, so I see one. What's your, I'm coming. What's your recommendation for people who struggle with soft copy books, considering they are easier to get? Okay, I've tweeted about this before, but what I do, okay, so there was a time when, if I'm reading soft copy books, I get really sleepy, right? So I just start reading and I start feeling sleepy and I just drop the book and or I drop the phone and start to sleep. So what I would say is first, if that is something you struggle with, first thing you want to do is read immediately after waking up, right? So you're just waking up, the chances of you feeling sleepy are slim. I mean, if you like to sleep, you still feel sleepy after waking up. But if you're active enough, at your most active time of day is when you should pick up a book to read, right? And you do not need, it's not a competition, right? You're not racing against time or racing against anybody. So read short portions per time. So my attention span can be low sometimes. So I could be reading and just, oh, let me go to Twitter, oh, let me go to IG, let me go here, let me go there. So what you can do is read small portions per time, right? No need to try to read an entire chapter or an entire part of the book. Yeah, just focus on little paragraphs per time. So you wake up today, you read two paragraphs. By noon, you read another two paragraphs. By evening, you read another two paragraphs, and you're making progress, right? It may take longer to finish the book, but you're making progress. So that's something you can do. I hope that helps. Let me see if there's anything else. Okay, I don't think there. Okay, do you suggest juggling multiple books or just one? I can't give a recommendation, right? But I'll tell you what I do. I read, I don't think there's ever a time where I'm reading just one book per time. I'm always reading multiple books. Is it a recommendation? I wouldn't say so. It's something that I do. So if it's something you can do, successfully, then please go ahead to do it, right? It's better to focus on one book and finish that book and move to the other. It's even faster that way. But if your attention span cannot keep you in one place, please feel free to move between books as long as you're not mixing up knowledge or forgetting stuff or anything like that. But yeah, I'm always reading multiple books per time. Let's see. I have an issue with documentation. Hi, Rukaya. I have an issue with documentation, documenting my process and all. Lately, I've had to do this, but I still struggle. Can you share some tips that can help? Let me see how much time I have. I'm out of time. But what I can do is I probably respond to this later on. But okay, let's see, document my process and as you're going through the process, just write about it. Yeah. So I worked on a project with Victor, right? Victor, who is a designer. I'm hoping he's safe. Here, Victor. Hi. So yeah, what I do is all the things that we're working on per time, I simply write about them in Notion. Yeah. So the features are listed out there. The change log, there's usually a change log, right? So any changes that happen, I just go to Notion and write them down. And on the actual design screens, whenever I make a major decision, I try to go back to Notion to write that down as well. Yeah. So it's ultimately about writing down the things that you do. And for interviews or for research, you're already writing down questions, you're already writing down objectives. So just make sure all of that is in one place and easily accessible. And I'll probably speak more about this later because I am out of time now. Let me see if there's anything else. Okay. I don't think there is. 1 second. Okay, but I'm basically out of time. So if I could not answer your question, please send it to me on Twitter, and I'll be happy to address it there. Thank you so much, guys, for being here with me. Thank you for all the support. And after this, I want to see your articles, right? I want to see articles that you write about your journey, right? Tell us your journey. Tell us that one thing that makes you different, that makes you unique from the crowd, that helps you stand out. Write about that. And please tag me so I can read and I can share as well. Thank you and bye.